From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Is Nancy Pelosi considering a trip to Taiwan? Will Russia abide by a deal to allow Ukrainian food exports? And who's in line to be Britain's next prime minister? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Joe Sternberg, based in London, and editorial page writer Jillian Melcher, who's taken 3 reporting trips to Ukraine in the past year or so. Welcome to you both. Speaker Nancy Pelosi might or might not be planning a visit to Taiwan next month, but either way, it has become a point of controversy in Washington and beyond. The Financial Times has reported that a trip is in the works. Nancy Pelosi's office has not confirmed that, but last week, Joe Biden weighed in. Listen to this.
Well, I think that the military thinks it's not a good idea right now, but I don't know what the status of it is.
And here was Speaker Pelosi's response.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide. But if the inference to draw on from your comment is that my going there is problematic, I think what the president was saying is maybe the military was afraid our plane would get shot down or something like that by the Chinese. I don't know exactly. I didn't see it. I didn't hear it. You're telling me, and I've heard it anecdotally, but I haven't heard it from the president.
Jillian, what's going on here with this debate in Washington about this trip, and what's to be gained by a visit to Taiwan by somebody like Nancy Pelosi?
Well, I think it's a really important symbolic show of support for Taiwan. But when it plays out like it has very publicly, with the Biden administration expressing concerns, speculation about the Chinese reaction, I think that brings us to a really dangerous moment here. I mean, we've seen China increase its provocation in Taiwan. And what I'm talking about is military planes going into Taiwanese airspace about 600 times this year, about 1,000 times last year. Beijing has responded furiously to the prospect of Nancy Pelosi's trip, has warned they will take action, that the U.S. will be responsible for this. It's kind of ambiguous. I think the concern here now is that if Pelosi doesn't go, it looks like the U.S. is backing down in response to Chinese threats. And that's not a good situation. At the same time, there is a risk involved in going. And I think that the fact that this is played out so publicly makes, our allies are watching, our adversaries are watching, and this has become really a referendum on U.S. commitment to the region.
Joe, you spent time in Asia before being posted to London, but how seriously do you take these threats from China? So the most recent one, the foreign ministry spokesman says, should the U.S. side insist on making the visit, China will act strongly to resolutely respond to it and take countermeasures. We mean what we say. But what kind of retaliation do you think is likely? I mean, surely, as Pelosi says, they wouldn't try to shoot down her plane, or at least the U.S. military wouldn't allow that.
You would assume not. I mean, part of the problem here is that it is difficult at this point to know exactly what the response might be. I mean, certainly visits by U.S. officials, whether it's politicians from the Congress or even sometimes officials from within the administration, are not at all unprecedented. I mean, they've happened from time to time. Beijing has never been happy about them because Beijing perceives this as undermining China's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan. And typically you would have strongly worded statements and a lot of heartburn over the visit, and then the visit would happen and people would move on with their lives in one form or another. I think the reason to be concerned now, first off, is that Biden, by bumbling into this issue, has managed to make it higher stakes for the Chinese as well. Because, Biden, his message that this visit might not be a good idea kind of legitimizes Beijing's complaint that it's not a good idea, where I think a much more helpful message from the president would have been, look, Americans do these visits from time to time. Congress is its own entity, independent of the White House, and we support the right of members of Congress to go where they think they should go. Instead, he kind of feeds into this Chinese paranoia by suggesting that there is some broader policy consideration about this visit underway. And, that paranoia in Beijing is being amplified at a time when the Chinese economy is under strain. And so President Xi Jinping also feels under strain about that and more inclined toward, nationalist rhetoric. So I think that somehow we ended up in a situation where partly through ineptitude in Washington, this has become a much higher stakes situation than it should have been.
The Associated Press has a report today that says that U.S. military sources say if Pelosi goes to Taiwan, which is still not certain, the military would increase its movement of forces and assets in the Indo-Pacific region. It quotes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, saying if there's a decision made that Speaker Pelosi or anyone else is going to travel and they ask for military support, we will do it as necessary to ensure a safe conduct of their visit, and I'll just leave it at that, unquote. But Jillian, to the point about what good this trip would do, I take the point about the symbolic value showing that the United States stands with Taiwan. But are there more concrete things that Taiwan needs from the U.S. in terms of aid, military equipment, and so forth to become a bit more of a porcupine? And that's not to say that it can completely forestall a Chinese invasion if China is determined to do it, but it could make it much more painful.
I think the symbolic significance of this visit is one thing, but the risk is that it's all going to be symbolically significant gestures, not backed up by any real action. But, I think it's helpful when we're thinking about Taiwan to look at the history of Ukraine as well. After 2014, there was this great opportunity to arm Ukraine and to deter Russia. And I think we're in a very similar situation with Taiwan right now, where there's an opportunity to provide military assistance and to beef up the deterrence before it's too late. This is the moment to do it. If you look at the situation in Ukraine, we've been able to make up lost time by providing weaponry across land borders of friendly countries. In Taiwan, that's going to be much more difficult because it's an island, and we've already seen the Chinese practicing for how to cut Taiwan off from outside support. They've been drilling urban warfare as well, with the eye to occupying Taiwanese cities potentially. So I do think it's a really important thing to be thinking about right now, how beyond symbolically significant gestures, we can support Taiwan and make it able to defend itself, because that opportunity may soon be closed.
To the point about how the publicity changes the dynamic here, and particularly President Biden's unhelpful insertion of himself into this news cycle, Joe, it seems to be now you can chart it now, and there are a few options. So the U.S. could say, we are not going to let China dictate where the Speaker of the House can go in the world, and she's going to be there on August 5th, and you better not do anything about it. Or she could do it this kind of trip in secret and then release some photos of it. I mean, that has happened in Ukraine, where American officials have just shown up in the capital of Kyiv, and we've gotten some photos and some briefing about it after the fact. Or, since this is still an unconfirmed plan, I mean, one way that Pelosi could save face is just to deny the reporting and say, I was never planning to go to Taiwan. There were some conversations, but it never turned into anything concrete, and we're not going to do it for XYZ reasons, scheduling. I mean, that would be a way to get out of this mess too. I mean, Joe, do you think I'm missing a fourth option there, or what do you make of these choices that they now have?
I think of the three that you laid out, unfortunately, I don't think that the third is really very possible at this point, partly because if this was only an unconfirmed rumor to begin with, Pelosi herself has allowed this to drag on long enough that it actually does look like, she is planning to go. And I think that it's also worth pointing out, you can't overestimate the amount of damage that Biden did with those comments, because one implication there is that now she can't not go and avoid having it look like somehow they bowed to this pressure. Whereas I think that, again, if Biden had come out in the beginning with a statement saying, look, the White House is not involved in the travel decisions of the Congress, this is a matter for her, and we support her right to go where she thinks she needs to go, that might have left open a graceful exit. They felt that they needed to do that. I think that the important thing now is that the visit does go ahead. I think that, unfortunately, any other option, for all of the political or diplomatic costs that might be involved in that trip, any option that involves not going only encourages more bad behavior from Beijing in the future, because they will have succeeded, at least in their own interpretation of events, they will have succeeded in blocking this visit, which is something that, clearly they're very keen to do.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. We've mentioned Ukraine a couple times already, so let's go there next. And there was supposed to be a deal on Friday that would allow Ukrainian grain to go out through Ukraine's last remaining port on the Black Sea, Odessa, and get through Russia's Black Sea blockade. That deal was struck on Friday, but then on Saturday, Russian missiles were used in an attack on Odessa. Jillian, can you give us a sense of the importance of this grain deal overall, and what do you make of the Russian strike then on this Ukrainian port immediately afterward?
Well, Ukraine accounts for about 9% of global wheat exports. It's the breadbasket of Europe, certainly. A lot of developing countries are very dependent on it for grain, and I think Putin knows this. He's using it as diplomatic leverage. Hunger leads to political instability, and he's used this pretty consistently as a way to try to rally people around the Russian side. So I do think this grain deal had the potential to be significant. The idea was that you'd be able to get all this grain that can't move by rail or by truck out through Ukrainian ports to break the blockade a little bit. I just think it's such an indication of Russia's untrustworthiness. It took less than 24 hours to conduct a missile strike on the Odessa port. And if you look at the text of the agreement, it explicitly includes commitments that no party can undertake an attack on port facilities, merchant vessels, or civilian ships that are used to transport grain. It's an instant Russian violation of its commitments, and that is pretty typical of Russian behavior. But I think the lesson for Western countries here is that there's been some talk or suggestion about pressuring Ukraine to come to a negotiated settlement to end this war. And if you can't even trust Russia to within 24 hours abide by this very limited international commitment, why on earth would you trust it on something as significant as protecting Ukraine?
But part of the story on the pressure for some kind of negotiated settlement seems to be this continued tale of a slow Western support to Ukraine. And Joe, you've mentioned on the podcast before the remarkable slowness of Germany's Cheetah tanks, but I understand they've now arrived. Do you think the time that it took for them to get there is another signal of the West's flagging interest in supporting Ukraine?
Yeah, so these anti-aircraft tanks were first promised back in April, which already was 2 months into the war. And so at that point, Berlin had been taking a lot of flack from both Ukraine and its allies for dragging its feet on promising the aid. And now it has taken another 3 months after that for the first 3 of these tanks to appear in Ukraine. And I think that does speak to this difficulty with resolve that the Western allies increasingly are running into. And it is this age-old problem of a disagreement about what the end state here should be and what kind of victory they think is reasonable for Ukraine to hope for or aspire to. So, for example, I sense that there is still a certain amount of resistance in Berlin to this notion that Ukraine could actually win the war in the sense of perhaps pushing the Russians beyond even the line that they had been left in after the 2014 conflict. I think Germany might think that it's more realistic to expect that just kind of you keep the Russians where they are as of today, kind of set the lines there. But if you don't have this broader commitment to actual victory, it becomes very difficult for you to get politicians in parts of Europe on board with unlocking more of the aid that Ukraine would need for any bigger sense of victory in this conflict. And, I think that this whole grain deal is of a piece with this Russian attempt to kind of divide the allies, because one consequence of this agreement and then breaking it is that now you're going to end up with this big diplomatic kerfuffle in the West about, well, should we be trying to revive the deal, or should we just completely scrap the deal and go back to whatever thinking that we had been doing about some kind of military solution to interfere with the Russian blockade? And I think that kind of argument among Western allies is exactly what Putin is very eager to encourage right now.
But the other side of the debate is the one I think that is being made in the journal's editorials, and I'll read just a couple lines from a recent one. It says, "The West is so far providing Ukraine with enough weapons not to lose, but not enough to take back its territory from Russia. The fastest way to a settlement is to convince Russia that the cost of war will keep growing and that it can't outlast the West," unquote. And Jillian, do you agree with that? And I guess, what is it that the Ukrainians are waiting for, the equipment that they've requested? You wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago, and the headline of that is "The West Leaves Ukraine Outgunned Against Russia." So what is it that they're saying they need?
Well, what they really need is long-range missiles, and a lot of them. Right now, Russia has an advantage both in the quantity of artillery and the range of artillery. And that basically means that Ukrainian soldiers have to go much closer to the front line, put themselves in danger, put their equipment in danger, and that Russia can attack further into Ukrainian territory, cut the soldiers on the front off from supply and support. And that when Ukrainian soldiers are picking their targets on the Russian side, they have to be really careful about it. Their options are limited in a way that Russia's are not. And Russia's conducting this really brutal form of warfare that is, the basic strategy is just to shell and to explode things on the front line without any concern for civilian casualties, for picking military targets. They are pounding everything and advancing kilometer by kilometer. I think in recent weeks we've seen HIMARS that have a bit longer of a range making a difference. Ukrainians have been able to conduct some attacks on ammunition depots, on command centers, but they need a lot more of them. And I think the fundamental concern here is Russia kind of tipped its hand in February. It made it just astoundingly clear that Putin's goal is control of Ukraine in its entirety. So I think that Ukrainians that I've spoken to certainly feel like if there's any negotiated settlement that involves territorial concessions, that this will work to Russia's benefit, because we know Russia doesn't operate in good faith, and we know what Russia's aim is here. And that basically gives the Russians a chance to pause, to build up the strength of their forces, to resupply their armaments, and make another go at taking over the entirety of Ukraine. So it's really important right now that the Ukrainians have what they need to push Russia back from occupied territory. And one thing I'm keeping a very close eye on right now is in the south. I mean, if Russia can occupy the south, it's taken a lot of it. Odessa is basically the only major port city under Kiev's control. I think there's going to be a big battle around Kherson. And if Ukrainians prevail, you'll see them kind of pushing the Russians back along the south. But conversely, if the Russians prevail, they'll be able to cut Ukraine off from this very economically significant region, make it a landlocked country effectively. So in that case, I think we need to be paying attention to what happens next with Russian expansionism, whether Moldova is going to be next. So this is a pretty important moment to be providing the Ukrainians with what they need militarily.
Finally, in the wake of Boris Johnson's announcement that he would resign as Britain's prime minister, the Conservative Party is having a leadership contest, and it has now whittled that down to two candidates. Joe, can you give us a sense of who they are, whether either of these candidates seems capable of leading Britain out of this funk, and what's the process for this kind of mid-election leadership change? Because we don't have an analog for that in the United States.
Yeah, well, I'll take the last question first because it's kind of the easiest one. I mean, basically in a parliamentary system like the UK, whoever happens to be the leader of the majority party in the parliament will end up becoming the prime minister. So, Boris Johnson having stepped down from that leadership role, they're now selecting someone who will replace him as the Conservative leader in the parliament. And that person then more or less automatically becomes the prime minister. Procedure then has been kind of shaped by the fact that there is this interaction with the Conservative members of Parliament here. It was actually the Conservative MPs who have whittled down the field over the past few weeks from 7 or 8 at the beginning to the final 2. And those final 2 are now going out to the several 100,000 registered members of the Conservative Party across the country, ordinary voters who will vote by mail with the result announced in September. And those 2 finalists are Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Treasury Secretary Rishi Sunak, who I think are kind of interesting because they're offering those Tories a real choice on a lot of economic policy. I think that Rishi Sunak is trying to represent the fiscal responsibility wing of the Conservative Party. So he is very opposed to tax cutting until there's a way to quote unquote pay for it. I think that Liz Truss is really on the economy trying to chart a bolder course that would kind of involve front-loading a lot of the tax cuts and then dealing with the savings on government spending or planning on economic growth down the road to recoup some of the lost revenue from those tax policies. And that is becoming the main focus of this debate just because the economy is in a very difficult condition right now. There's an inflation crisis going on. People are seeing their energy bills going up. I think that there's a growing realization that growth is slowing pretty badly. So I think that the conservatives have ended up with this opportunity for a big policy reset at a good time with about 2 years to go before they would have to call another election, while they might still have some hope of turning around the economy before they go back to voters.
But last thought here, it seems like in recent days there have been whispers that Boris Johnson wants to hold on. He regrets resigning. Is there any chance that that is the final outcome here, or has that ship pretty much sailed?
Well, I mean, I've learned over the past few years to never say never about anything, but I think that there is a reason that people were keen to push him out, and it had to do with a combination of the sense that he was losing control of economic management and losing credibility on that, and also just these various scandals that he kept being embroiled in were not good for the party. And in fact, the conservatives had suffered a couple of pretty serious losses in by-elections that happened in a couple parliamentary seats that they had held until June. And so I wouldn't rule it out, but I think that he would have an awful lot of persuading to do to convince members of the party at this point that a comeback was the right thing to pull themselves out of the hole that he helped to dig.
Thank you, Joe and Jillian. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.